The mason's hands were scarred from 20 years of working stone, but they had never trembled until the morning he found an orc girl sleeping in his unfinished wall. Quinton Olson had built his reputation on steady hands and steadier work. Yet here he stood with his trowel hanging loose in his grip, staring at the impossible sight of green skin and dark hair tucked between the rocks he had laid the previous evening. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19 by his guess, though he had never been close enough to an orc to judge their ages properly. Her breathing came shallow and quick, the kind of exhausted sleep that spoke of days without rest. Blood darkened the hem of her rough spun tunic, and her bare feet were torn and dirty. One of her hands clutched a piece of bread so hard the crust had crumbled between her fingers. Quinton glanced back toward the road that wound through the valley toward the nearest village. 3 miles of empty farmland stretched between his property and civilization, if you could call a collection of 40 families and a trading post civilization. He had chosen this isolation deliberately after the war, wanting nothing more than the peace of working stone and the quiet company of his own thoughts. Now that peace had been shattered by the presence of someone who would bring him nothing but trouble if anyone discovered her here. The smart thing would be to wake her and send her on her way. The safer thing would be to pretend he had never seen her at all and let her move on while he worked elsewhere on his property. Quinton Olson had survived 5 years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front by making smart and safe decisions. He set down his trowel and walked to his cottage to fetch a blanket and some proper food. When he returned, the orc girl was awake and pressed against the far side of the wall with eyes wide and wild. Her tusks were small, barely protruding past her lower lip, but she bared them at him in a gesture that might have been threatening if she had not been shaking so badly. Up close, he could see that the blood on her clothes had come from a wound in her side, poorly bandaged with strips of cloth that had once been part of a sleeve. "I am not going to hurt you," Quinton said, keeping his voice level and calm the way he might speak to a spooked horse. He held out the blanket and a wrapped package of bread and cheese. "You are injured and you need food. That is all I am offering." She did not move except to track him with her eyes, dark amber in color and bright with fever. Her ears, pointed and mobile, swiveled toward him and then back toward the road. Listening for pursuit, he realized, running from something or someone. "My name is Quinton," he continued, setting the items on top of the wall between them. "This is my land. That wall you are leaning against is part of a sheepfold I am building. The nearest village is 3 miles east, and I do not go there more than once a month. No one comes out here." Still she said nothing, but her eyes flicked to the food and back to his face. Quinton took 3 steps backward, then turned and walked to his work area where he had left his tools. He made a show of examining the mortar he had mixed earlier, testing its consistency, giving her space to decide whether to trust him or run. From the corner of his eye, he watched her snatch the food and blanket and disappear around the far side of the wall. He heard the sound of desperate eating, the kind that came from a belly that had been empty too long. Good. Let her eat and rest. He would finish the section of wall he had planned for today, and then decide what to do about an orc girl who had appeared in his life like a ghost from the war he had tried so hard to forget. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of work. Lift stone, check level, apply mortar, set stone, tap into place. The sun climbed higher and the spring air grew warm. Quinton worked with his back to the wall where the girl hid, giving her the dignity of not being watched while she ate. His mind wandered as his hands moved through motions they had performed 10,000 times before. He had seen orcs during the war, of course. Everyone had. They had fought on both sides of the conflict, depending on which human kingdom had promised them land or gold, or simply a chance to survive. The propaganda had called them savages and monsters, but the orc soldiers Quinton had seen had fought and died the same as any human. He remembered one in particular, a huge warrior who had held a bridge against Quinton's unit for nearly an hour before falling. The orc had been protecting a wagon of wounded soldiers behind him, soldiers of both races, Quinton had later discovered. That memory had troubled him more than the actual fighting. "Why do you build walls?" The voice startled him so badly he nearly dropped the stone he was holding. The orc girl had moved around the corner of the wall without making a sound and now stood 10 feet away, wrapped in the blanket despite the warmth of the day. She looked steadier on her feet, but her face was still pale beneath the green of her skin. "To keep sheep in," Quinton said, settling the stone carefully into place. "Or to mark property boundaries, or because someone pays me to build them. I am a mason. Building with stone is what I do." "Why stone?" She took a half-step closer, her eyes on his hands as they smoothed mortar into the gaps. "Wood is faster. Stone lasts." Quinton selected another rock from his pile, turning it to find the best face. "A wooden fence rots or burns. A stone wall stands for generations if it is built properly. My grandfather built walls that are still standing. My great-grandfather built walls that are still standing. Someday, long after I am dead, someone will look at this wall and know that I was here." The girl considered this, her head tilted slightly to one side. "What is your name again?" "Quinton Olson. I am Grelda." She said it simply, without the family name or clan designation that he understood orcs usually carried. "A bad sign. You said you would not tell anyone I am here." "I said no one comes here. I did not promise anything else." Quinton straightened and met her eyes. "But I am not in the habit of causing trouble for people who are clearly already in enough of it. That wound in your side needs proper cleaning and bandaging. Can you walk to the cottage?" Grelda pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Why would you help me?" "Because you are hurt and on my property, and I am not the kind of man who ignores that." He set down his tools and wiped his hands on his work apron. "You can accept help or you can refuse it, but standing here arguing about it is a waste of both our time." For a moment, he thought she would run. Her whole body tensed and her eyes darted toward the open land beyond his property. Then she swayed slightly and caught herself against the wall. The fever was worse than he had thought. "All right," she said quietly. The cottage was small and plain, a single room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace that Quinton had built himself. He had designed it for solitude and efficiency, not for guests, but it was clean and well organized. Grelda sank onto the wooden bench by the table while Quinton pulled out his medical supplies, such as they were. A farmer's kit of bandages and salves, needle and thread for stitching, and a bottle of strong spirits for cleaning wounds. "I need to look at your side," he said, and Grelda nodded and pulled up the edge of her tunic with shaking hands. The wound was a deep gash, possibly from a blade, and it had begun to fester. Quinton swore under his breath and set water to boil over the fire. This was going to hurt and there was no way around it. "How did this happen?" he asked while he worked, more to distract her than because he needed to know. "A human patrol caught me near the border." Grelda's voice was tight with pain as he cleaned the wound. "They thought I was scouting for a raiding party. I told them I was alone, but they did not believe me. One of them cut me when I tried to run." "Why were you near the border?" "Because I have nowhere else to go," she hissed as he applied the burning spirits to her skin. "My clan cast me out 3 months ago. I have been traveling ever since, trying to find somewhere I could settle. But humans do not want orcs near their villages, and orc clans do not want a cast-out among them." Quinton threaded the needle and glanced up at her face. "Why did they cast you out?" "Because I refused to marry the warrior they chose for me." Grelda's jaw set stubbornly. He was cruel and violent, and I told the clan leaders I would rather die alone than live as his wife, so they granted my wish and sent me away. The needle pierced her skin, and she gripped the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went pale, but she did not cry out. Quinton worked as quickly and gently as he could, drawing the wound closed with small, even stitches. He had done this before during the war, though never for an orc. Her skin was tougher than human flesh, harder to pierce, but the principle was the same. "There," he said finally, tying off the thread and applying a clean bandage. "That should hold if you do not tear it open again. You need rest and food and time for the fever to break." "You can stay here until you are well enough to travel." Grelda stared at him. "Why?" "I already told you why." "No, you told me you are not the kind of man who ignores someone hurt on your property, but I am an orc. Your people and my people have been killing each other for as long as anyone can remember. Why would you help me?" Quinton packed away his supplies and poured her a cup of water from the pitcher. "Because I have seen enough killing and it did not solve anything. Because you are a person who needs help and I have help to give. Because it is the right thing to do. Take your pick." She drank the water in silence, studying him over the rim of the cup. Finally, she said, "Thank you. You are welcome. Now rest. The loft is warmer, but the climb might be too much with that wound. You can take my bed and I will sleep by the fire." Grelda opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it again and nodded. She was asleep within minutes of lying down, the exhausted sleep of someone who had been running on nothing but fear and determination for too long. Quinton covered her with another blanket and went back outside to finish his work on the wall. The days fell into a pattern. Quinton rose at dawn and made breakfast, leaving food and fresh water within reach of the bed before going out to work on the wall. Grelda slept most of the first few days, waking only to eat and tend to basic needs. He checked her wound each evening and was relieved to see that the infection was receding and the fever breaking. She was young and strong, and her body fought hard to heal itself. By the end of the first week, she was well enough to sit outside and watch him work. Quinton found her presence oddly companionable. She did not chatter or ask endless questions, but she observed everything with intense focus. He caught her studying the way he selected stones, the way he mixed mortar, the way he tested each course with his level to ensure the wall stood true. "How do you know which stone goes where?" she asked on the 8th day. Quinton set down the rock he was holding and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Experience, mostly, but also understanding what you want the wall to do. Each stone has a shape and a strength. You learn to see how they will fit together, how the weight will distribute, where the stress points will be." He picked up the stone again and turned it in his hands. "This one is broad and flat, good for the base course where you need stability. That one over there is more vertical, better for filling in the face of the wall where you need height." Grelda stood and walked closer, moving carefully to avoid pulling her stitches. "Can anyone learn to do this? Anyone with patience and a willingness to work hard. The strength required is not as much as you might think. It is more about leverage and technique than raw power." He set the stone in place and tapped it level. "Why do you ask?" "I am trying to decide what I will do when I leave here. I need a trade, some way to support myself. I can hunt and track, but those skills do not help much when humans will not let me near their towns." She crouched beside the wall, running her fingers along the stones he had already set. "But if I could build things, useful things, maybe I could trade work for food and shelter. Maybe I could survive on my own." Quinton considered her thoughtfully. The idea was not without merit. Orcs were known to be strong and hardy, and Grelda had already demonstrated that she was intelligent and determined. But masonry was a craft that took years to learn properly, and she would face additional challenges from humans who would not want to hire an orc, no matter how skilled. "How long until you are healed enough to travel?" he asked. "Another week, maybe 2. She looked up at him, hope dawning in her eyes. "Are you saying you would teach me?" "I am saying I could show you the basics while you are here, enough that you would know whether this is something you truly want to pursue. After that, you would need to find someone willing to take you on as an apprentice, which will not be easy." "I know it will not be easy. Nothing has been easy." Grelda stood and met his gaze squarely. "But I am willing to work. I am willing to learn. If you will teach me, I will be the best student you could ask for." Something in her earnest determination reminded Quinton of himself at her age, desperate to prove he could make something of his life despite the circumstances he had been born into. He had been lucky enough to have a grandfather who believed in him and taught him a trade. Perhaps he could offer the same chance to someone who needed it just as badly. "All right," he said. "We will start tomorrow." Teaching Grelda turned out to be one of the most rewarding experiences Quinton had known in years. She approached learning masonry with the same intense focus she had brought to watching him work. Nothing was too small or too basic for her attention. She wanted to know the names of tools and the properties of different types of stone. She wanted to understand why mortar was mixed to certain consistencies and how weather affected the work. She practiced gripping the trowel until her hands cramped, determined to master the proper technique. "No, like this," Quinton said, adjusting her grip. "You want to control it with your fingers, not your whole hand. See, more delicate. You are spreading mortar, not chopping wood." Grelda nodded and tried again, her tongue caught between her tusks in concentration. The motion was smoother this time, more controlled. She spread a line of mortar along the top course of the practice wall they were building together, and Quinton was pleased to see that the thickness was almost even. "Better. Now set your stone. Remember to check that the face is flush with the course below." She selected a stone from the pile, turned it once, then set it firmly into the mortar. Her hands were large and strong, but she was learning to use that strength with precision. She tapped the stone with the handle of her trowel, adjusting its position until it sat level. "How is that?" she asked. Quinton checked her work with a critical eye. The stone was well seated, the mortar joints were acceptable, and the face was nearly flush. For someone who had been learning for less than 2 weeks, it was impressive work. "Good," he said, and meant it. "Very good. You have an eye for this." The smile that spread across Grelda's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it transformed her whole appearance. She was pretty, he realized with some surprise. He had grown so accustomed to her presence that he had stopped thinking of her as an orc and simply thought of her as Grelda, his student and guest. But now he saw her clearly. The warm green of her skin, the dark shine of her hair, the bright intelligence in her eyes, the way her tusks curved up from her lower lip in a way that was oddly charming. Quinton turned away quickly, unsettled by the direction of his thoughts. She was an orc, and he was human, and there were 1,000 reasons why he should not be noticing whether she was pretty. He focused on mixing a fresh batch of mortar and tried to ignore the warmth in his chest. They worked together through the spring, the practice wall growing longer and more complex as Grelda's skills improved. Quinton taught her how to build corners and how to tie new sections into existing walls. He showed her the technique for creating drainage weep holes and how to cap a wall to shed water. She absorbed it all with fierce dedication, often working until her hands bled and Quinton had to order her to stop and rest. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. Grelda told him about growing up in her clan, about the strict hierarchies and the constant pressure to prove herself strong enough to survive. She spoke of her mother, who had died when Grelda was young, and her father, who had disowned her when she refused the marriage. She described the loneliness of being cast out, of wandering through lands where everyone saw her as a monster or a threat. Quinton found himself sharing things he had not spoken of in years. He told her about his grandfather, the master mason who had raised him after his parents died. He described the war and the things he had seen, the waste and brutality of it, the way it had left him hollow and searching for peace. He explained why he had chosen this isolated property, why he worked alone, why he had thought he wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world. "Do you still think that?" Grelda asked one evening. They were sitting on the completed practice wall watching the sun set over the valley. "That you want nothing to do with the world?" Quinton considered the question carefully. 6 weeks ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. Now, with Grelda beside him and the sound of her laughter still echoing from dinner, he was not so sure. "I think perhaps I was confusing solitude with peace," he said finally. "I thought if I was alone, I would not have to deal with all the things that hurt during the war. The loss and the fear and the anger. But being alone just meant I had nothing else to think about except those things. And now I have someone to teach, someone to talk to, someone who makes me remember what it feels like to be part of something larger than just myself." He glanced at her. "I had forgotten how good that feels." Grelda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "I will have to leave soon. I am healed now, and I have learned enough to begin practicing on my own. I cannot stay here forever." The words hit Quinton like a physical blow, though he had known they were coming. Of course she would have to leave. He had known from the beginning that she was only here temporarily, that as soon as she was well enough she would move on. But somehow, over the past weeks, he had stopped thinking about that inevitability. He had grown comfortable with her presence, had come to look forward to seeing her each morning, had started to think of his cottage as their cottage rather than his alone. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I do not know. Somewhere far from here where the patrols are less frequent, maybe west toward the mountains. I could find work with farmers or shepherds, building walls and structures, build a reputation slowly." She drew her knees up to her chest. "It will be hard, I know that. But at least now I have a chance." "You could stay here," Quinton heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised her. "Not forever necessarily, but longer, until you are truly ready. The sheepfold is finished, but I have a dozen other projects planned. A proper barn, a smokehouse, stone terraces for a garden. You could keep learning, keep practicing, and you would have a safe place to work from." "Quinton." Grelda turned to face him fully. "You know that is not possible. If anyone from the village finds out you are sheltering an orc, they will drive you out too. They might do worse than that. You could lose everything you have built here. Only if someone finds out, and I already told you, no one comes here. Someone will eventually. A traveler, a peddler, a neighbor needing help. And when they do, I will bring nothing but trouble down on you." She shook her head. "I am grateful for everything you have done. You saved my life and gave me a future, but I will not repay that by destroying yours." Quinton wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could protect her, that they could make it work. But he knew she was right. The world beyond his property line was not kind to orcs or to the humans who helped them. He had been foolish to think they could exist in this peaceful bubble forever. "When will you go?" he asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning. Early before dawn. That way you can honestly say you woke up and I was gone if anyone ever asks. I will pack food for you and take my spare cloak. The nights are still cold. Thank you." Grelda reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and calloused from weeks of working stone. "For everything. I will never forget what you have done for me." They sat together until the stars came out, not talking, just holding hands and watching the night settle over the valley. Quinton tried to memorize everything about the moment. The weight of her hand in his, the sound of her breathing, the way she smelled of stone dust, and the lavender soap he kept by the wash basin. He had known her for less than 2 months, but the thought of her leaving felt like losing part of himself. When they finally went inside, Grelda climbed to the loft for the first time since she had arrived. Quinton lay down by the fire but did not sleep. He listened to her move around in the darkness above him and wondered if she was having as much trouble sleeping as he was. The cottage felt too quiet, as if it already knew she was leaving and was grieving her absence. At first light, Quinton rose and made breakfast. He packed bread and cheese and dried meat into a cloth bundle, added apples from his small store and a water skin. The spare cloak was wool, warm and weatherproof. He laid everything on the table and then stood staring at it, trying to think if there was anything else she might need. Money would help, but he had precious little. Tools were expensive and he could not spare his own without crippling his ability to work. Grelda came down from the loft dressed in the clothes she had been wearing when she arrived, cleaned and mended as best as Quinton had been able to manage. She had washed her face and braided her hair. She looked stronger than she had 6 weeks ago, healthier and more confident, but her eyes were sad. "I left something for you in the loft," she said. "A gift. Do not look at it until I am gone. Grelda, please." She picked up the bundle and the cloak. "This is hard enough. Let me go quickly." Quinton nodded, not trusting his voice. He walked with her to the door and stood watching as she set off across the valley toward the west. She did not look back. He stayed in the doorway until she disappeared over the rise, a small figure moving steadily away from him toward an uncertain future. The cottage felt unbearably empty when he finally went back inside. Quinton made himself wait a full hour before climbing to the loft to see what Grelda had left behind. On the narrow bed where she had slept, he found a stone. It was not a particularly notable stone at first glance, just a piece of gray granite about the size of his palm. But when he picked it up, he realized that she had carved it. The surface was covered with intricate marks and symbols, the kind that orcs used in their own language. He could not read them, but the craftsmanship was remarkable. She must have worked on it late at night while he slept below, slowly and painstakingly shaping the hard stone with nothing but a nail and endless patience. Quinton carried the stone down from the loft and set it on the mantel above the fireplace. He stared at it for a long time, wishing he knew what it said, wishing he could thank her for it. Eventually, he forced himself to go outside and begin work on the barn foundation he had planned. Work was the only thing that had gotten him through grief before. Perhaps it would do so again. The weeks after Grelda left were difficult. Quinton had grown accustomed to having someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, someone to teach and learn from. Working alone again felt like going backward, like losing something vital. He caught himself starting to explain things out loud before remembering she was not there to listen. He cooked too much food at dinner and sat staring at the empty chair across the table. At night, the cottage seemed too large and too quiet. He thought about her constantly. Where was she now? Had she found work? Was she safe? The not knowing gnawed at him worse than her absence. He told himself it was natural to worry about a student, about someone he had helped. But late at night, lying awake by the dying fire, he had to admit the truth. He missed her. Not just her help or her company, but her specifically. The way she laughed at his dry jokes, the fierce concentration on her face when she was learning something new, the sound of her voice, the warmth of her hand in his. Summer arrived and Quinton threw himself into work with almost desperate energy. He completed the barn foundation and began raising the walls. He built stone terraces for a garden and planted vegetables. He repaired the roof and replaced worn tools and did everything he could think of to keep himself occupied. But no amount of work could fill the void Grelda had left behind. In midsummer, Quinton made his monthly trip to the village for supplies. He was loading flour and beans into his wagon when he overheard two farmers talking nearby. "I am telling you, there is an orc working over in the Westfield territory," the first man said. "Jensen saw her building a wall for the Pritchard family. Said she worked faster than any 3 human masons, and the wall was solid as bedrock." "An orc? Why would anyone hire an orc? Apparently she works cheap and does not complain, and the Pritchards do not care what she is as long as she gets the job done. You know how they are, always going for the lowest price. Still seems risky. What if she is scouting for a war party that builds stone walls? You have been listening to too many old war stories." Quinton's heart was pounding. Westfield territory was about 40 miles northwest of his property, well beyond the mountains. It had to be Grelda. How many orc masons could there be? She had made it, had found work, was building the future she had dreamed of. Relief and pride surged through him so strongly he had to grip the edge of the wagon to steady himself. "Did Jensen say anything else about her?" Quinton asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Both farmers turned to look at him with surprise. Quinton rarely spoke to anyone in the village and certainly did not engage in gossip. "Just that she is young and quiet and does good work," the first farmer said. "Why? You thinking of hiring her, maybe? I have been planning a new wall around my property. It would be a big job." Quinton handed over coins for his supplies. "Did Jensen say where she is staying?" "Some old shepherd's hut near the Pritchard farm, I think. But if you go looking for her, be careful. The patrol has been watching her. They are not happy about having an orc in the territory, even if she has not caused any trouble." Quinton nodded and finished loading his wagon. His mind was racing as he drove back to his property. He could go to Westfield. It was not impossibly far. He could see for himself that Grelda was safe and well. He could talk to her, tell her. What? That he missed her. That he had feelings for her he did not fully understand. What good would that do except make both of them miserable? No, it was better to leave things as they were. She had her life and he had his. The fact that she was doing well was enough. It had to be enough. But knowing she was out there, so close and yet unreachable, made the loneliness worse instead of better. Quinton found himself staring west at odd hours, wondering what she was doing, whether she ever thought of him. The carved stone on his mantel became a kind of talisman. He touched it every morning and every evening, trying to decode its meaning through sheer force of will. Autumn arrived and brought cold rains. Quinton completed the barn and moved on to smaller projects, repairs and improvements. He should have been satisfied with all he had accomplished. The property was taking shape into something substantial, something that would last. But satisfaction eluded him. Every completed wall was a reminder of the student who was not there to see it. Every day alone was a reminder of the companionship he had lost. In late autumn, nearly 6 months after Grelda had left, Quinton woke to the sound of someone knocking on his door. He sat up in confusion, disoriented by the darkness. No one ever came to his property, especially not in the middle of the night. He grabbed the fire poker as an improvised weapon and approached the door cautiously. "Who is there?" he called. "Quinton." "It is me." He knew that voice. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely lift the latch. The door swung open and there stood Grelda, soaked from rain and breathing hard as if she had been running. She looked thinner than he remembered but strong and healthy. Her eyes were bright with emotion he could not name. "Grelda." His voice came out hoarse. "What are you doing here? Are you all right? Are you being pursued? No, nothing like that. I am fine. She took a deep breath. I have been working in Westfield, did you know? I heard rumors in the village. I have been taking every job I can get. Building walls, repairing structures, anything that needed stonework. I saved every coin. I barely spent anything on food or shelter. And I learned, Quinton, I learned so much. I worked with other masons and watched their techniques. I practiced until my hands bled. I became good, really good. People started seeking me out specifically because they heard my work was the best available. I am proud of you, Quinton said and meant it. But why are you here? Did something go wrong? No, everything went right. Grelda smiled, that same sunrise smile he remembered so well. Come with me. I need to show you something. She took his hand and pulled him out into the rain. Quinton grabbed his cloak but did not bother with boots, too confused and overwhelmed to think clearly. Grelda led him away from the cottage, around the barn, toward the far corner of his property where a small rise overlooked the valley. It was the spot he had once mentioned wanting to build a house, a real house, something more substantial than his small cottage. At the top of the rise stood a building. Quinton stopped walking, staring in disbelief. It was a house, a beautiful stone house with a peaked roof and glass windows and a wide front door. Even in the darkness, he could see the quality of the craftsmanship. The stones were perfectly fitted, the corners were plumb, the walls were true. It was better than anything he could have built himself, better than most of the work he had seen in his entire career. How? His voice failed him. I started coming here 2 months ago, Grelda said. At night, after my other jobs were finished. I would work until dawn and then travel back to Westfield before anyone woke up. I quarried the stone from the old outcrop beyond your northern boundary. I cut the timbers from fallen trees in the woods. The windows I had to buy and the nails, but everything else I made with my own hands. Quinton walked toward the house like a man in a trance. The front door was oak, heavy and well hung. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room with a sleeping loft above, a massive stone fireplace on one wall, and a kitchen area with built-in stone counters. There was space for a table and chairs, space for storage, space to live and work and breathe. The stone floor was perfectly level. The walls were works of art, each stone selected and placed with obvious care. The roof still needs work, Grelda said from behind him. She sounded nervous now, uncertain. And I have not built furniture yet, though I thought I could learn woodworking if you would teach me like you taught me stone. And the loft needs a railing and there should be shutters for the windows, and I want to build a root cellar, but I ran out of time. Why? Quinton turned to face her. His chest felt tight, his eyes stinging. Why did you do this? Grelda met his gaze steadily. Because you gave me everything. You saved my life. You taught me a trade. You gave me hope when I had none. I wanted to give you something in return, something worthy of what you did for me, and I thought. She hesitated, then continued. I thought if I built you a home, a real home, it might be a place where both of us could belong. If you wanted that. If you wanted me. The rain pounded on the roof above them. Water dripped from Quinton's hair down his face. His heart was beating so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. I have thought about you every single day since you left, he said. I thought I wanted to be alone, but all I have done is miss you. The cottage was too quiet. The work was too empty. Everything reminded me that you were gone, and I had let you go because I thought it was the right thing to do. And now, Grelda whispered, now I am tired of doing the right thing if it means being without you. Quinton closed the distance between them and took her hands in his. They were cold from the rain but strong, marked with calluses and scars from months of hard work. Beautiful hands. I do not care that you are an orc and I am human. I do not care what anyone else thinks. I care about you, Grelda. I want you to stay, not as a student or a guest, but as a partner, as the person I share my life with, if that is what you want too. Yes. The word was barely audible. Yes, that is what I want. That is what I have wanted for months, but I was afraid to hope for it. I thought you only saw me as a student, as someone you were helping out of kindness. I did not know if you could ever see me as something more. I see you, Quinton said. I have seen you from the beginning. You are brave and strong and clever. You are dedicated and hardworking and kind. You are beautiful and funny, and you make me want to be a better man than I was before I met you. Grelda made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. She pulled her hands free from his and wrapped her arms around him, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. Quinton buried his face in her wet hair and held her just as tightly, feeling something that had been broken inside him finally start to heal. They stood there for a long time, just holding each other in the empty house. The rain gradually softened to a drizzle and then stopped altogether. Through the windows, Quinton could see the sky beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. I cannot believe you built this, he said finally. An entire house, by yourself, in secret. It was not entirely by myself. Some of the Westfield workers helped with the heavy timbers, though I did not tell them where I was building. They thought I was working on a project for a client. Grelda pulled back enough to look up at him. Do you like it? Is it the kind of house you would want to live in? Like it? Grelda, it is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me. The craftsmanship alone is extraordinary. But the fact that you built it for me, for us, that you spent months working through the night because you wanted to make this. He shook his head, unable to find words adequate to express what he felt. It is perfect. You are perfect. She smiled and reached up to touch his face. I am far from perfect, but I am yours if you will have me. Always, Quinton said and kissed her. Her tusks made the angle slightly awkward at first, but they figured it out quickly. The kiss was warm and sweet and tasted of rain. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. Grelda took his hand and led him from room to non-existent room, pointing out features and explaining her choices. She showed him where she thought a workshop could be built, where a garden would get the best sun, where a well should be dug. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Quinton found himself adding suggestions, building on her ideas, imagining a future together in this place she had created. As the sun rose, they walked down to the cottage together to make breakfast and dry off. The little building that had felt so empty now seemed cozy and welcoming, perhaps because Grelda was there again. They sat at the table and ate bread and cheese and talked about everything and nothing, making up for months of separation. What will people say when they find out you are living with an orc? Grelda asked eventually, her tone more curious than worried. They will say whatever they want to say. The nearest neighbors are miles away, and I have never been close with anyone in the village anyway. As long as we are not actively causing trouble, I suspect most people will ignore us. Quinton refilled her cup with tea. And if they do not, if someone tries to force you away, then we will go somewhere else. There are always frontiers that need masons. We could go west to the mountains or south to the coast, anywhere you want. I do not want to uproot your whole life. My life is wherever you are now, Quinton said simply. Everything else is just property. Grelda blinked rapidly, her eyes shining. How did I get so lucky to find you? I think luck had very little to do with it. I think you were brave enough to keep surviving until we found each other. That is not luck. That is strength. They spent the day moving Quinton's belongings from the cottage to the new house. It did not take long. He had never accumulated much in the way of possessions. The furniture would have to stay in the cottage for now until they built or acquired new pieces. But his tools, his clothes, his books, the carved stone from the mantel, These all found new homes in the stone house on the rise. That evening, they stood together in the doorway watching the sun set over the valley. The house was still mostly empty, but it felt like home in a way the cottage never quite had. Perhaps because it had been built by both of them in a sense. Grelda had laid the stones, but Quinton had trained her hands. Their shared knowledge and effort had created these walls. "I have one more thing to show you," Grelda said. She went to the fireplace and pointed to a stone in the mantel, centered above the hearth. "Can you read what it says?" Quinton leaned close and saw that the stone was carved with the same symbols that had covered the stone Grelda had left for him. But this time, there were common letters mixed in with the Orcish script. He sounded them out slowly. "Home is where the heart returns," he read. "Is that what the other stone said too, the one you left in the cottage?" "Yes, I wanted you to have something to remember me by. Something that would tell you that wherever I went, my heart would always return to you." She leaned against his shoulder. "I did not know then if I would ever have the chance to make that return real, but I hoped." Quinton turned and pulled her into his arms. "You never have to leave again. This is your home now. We are home." The next weeks were busy with the work of settling in and finishing the house. Quinton built a bed frame and a table from wood he had stored in his workshop. Grelda completed the loft railing and began work on shutters for the windows. Together they dug a root cellar and lined it with stone. They terraced the land around the house and prepared it for spring planting. The work was hard but satisfying, made better by the fact that they did it together. Word eventually spread that Quinton Olson was living with an orc woman. A few people from the village made the trip out to his property, more out of curiosity than concern. They found a well-built house, a productive farm, and two people who were clearly devoted to each other. Most of them left scratching their heads but willing to let it be. A few muttered about unnatural relationships and the degradation of human society, but Quinton and Grelda were far enough removed that the muttering did not reach them. The patrol came once, 3 soldiers who demanded to know what an orc was doing on human land. Quinton showed them his property deed and informed them that Grelda was his employee and partner. The soldiers did not like it, but they had no legal grounds to remove her. She had committed no crime, and she was on private property with the owner's permission. They warned Quinton that he would be held responsible for anything she did, then left with obvious reluctance. "That was frightening," Grelda said after they had gone. "I thought they were going to arrest me. They would have had to go through me first." Quinton put his arm around her. "And I am a veteran. They know I can fight if I have to. They will not risk a confrontation without better cause than they have now. I do not want you to have to fight because of me. I do not want to fight either, but I will protect what is mine, and you are mine just as I am yours." That is what partnership means. As winter approached, Quinton and Grelda settled into the rhythms of their new life together. They worked on projects around the property during the day and spent evenings by the fire, talking and planning for the future. Quinton taught Grelda to read common script, and she taught him some of the Orcish language. They were both slow students in this regard, but they made each other laugh with their mistakes, and that was what mattered. One evening in late autumn, nearly a year after Grelda had first appeared in Quinton's unfinished wall, they sat together at their table sharing dinner. The house was warm and filled with the smell of stew and fresh bread. Through the windows, they could see the first snow of the season beginning to fall. "I have been thinking," Grelda said. "We should expand, take on more jobs. We could become a real masonry business, the two of us working together. You have the experience and reputation. I have the strength and speed. Together we could build things that neither of us could manage alone." Quinton considered this. He had always worked alone, but the idea of partnering with Grelda professionally as well as personally held strong appeal. They worked well together, and her skills had grown to match his own in many ways. "What about the prejudice?" he asked. "Many people will not want to hire an orc, no matter how skilled she is. Then we will work for the people who care more about quality than prejudice. And we will build such beautiful, solid structures that eventually even the prejudiced will have to admit that we do good work." Grelda's eyes shone with enthusiasm. "We could make a real name for ourselves, not just Quinton Olson the Mason, but Olson and Grelda, Master Builders. We could change the way people think about orcs, show them that we can create, not just destroy." The ambition and hope in her voice made Quinton's heart swell. This was what he had been missing in his solitary life before she came, not just companionship, but purpose that extended beyond himself. The chance to build something meaningful and lasting, not just in stone but in the world. "All right," he said. "We will do it. Together." They shook hands across the table, sealing their business partnership with the same ceremony they had used for their personal commitment. Then Grelda laughed and pulled him to his feet, and they danced around the kitchen in celebration, their shadows flickering in the firelight. Winter came in earnest, and they spent the cold months working in the cottage, which they had converted to a workshop. Quinton taught Grelda the finer points of stone carving, and together they created samples of decorative work: carved mantels, ornamental cornerstones, stone windowsills with intricate designs. These would serve as advertisements of their skill when spring came, and they began seeking work. During this time, Grelda also worked on a special project of her own. Quinton would sometimes find her in the corner of the workshop, bent over a large flat stone, carving with intense concentration. When he asked what she was making, she told him it was a surprise. He respected her privacy and did not push, though his curiosity was strong. As the days began to lengthen toward spring, Grelda finished her project. She asked Quinton to close his eyes, and she led him outside to the front of the house. The snow had melted enough to expose the ground near the entrance. "You can look now," she said. Quinton opened his eyes and saw that she had installed a stone marker near the door. It was a beautifully carved rectangle of gray granite set into the ground at an angle. The surface bore an inscription in both Orcish symbols and common letters, built in the year 1247 by Grelda and Quinton Olson. "Stone called to stone, heart called to heart, and here we made our home." Below the inscription was a date, the day she had first arrived at his property, wounded and desperate, and below that, "Olson and Grelda, Master Builders." Quinton could not speak. The marker was more than just a sign of their business. It was a declaration that they existed, that they had built this together, that their partnership was real and permanent. It claimed the house and the land as theirs jointly, human and orc, two lives intertwined. "You like it?" Grelda asked nervously. "I wanted something that would last, that would tell our story even after we are gone, like you said about your grandfather's walls." "I love it," Quinton managed. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "It is perfect. You are perfect." She laughed and held him tight. "We are perfect together. That is what matters." Spring arrived, and with it, the beginning of their business. They put the word out through the village and in the neighboring territories that Olson and Grelda were available for masonry work. The response was mixed. Some people were intrigued by the novelty and quality of their samples. Others wanted nothing to do with an orc, business partner or not. Their first major commission came from an unexpected source. The Pritchard family, who had originally hired Grelda in Westfield, contacted them about building a large barn. They had been impressed by her earlier work and did not care about her race as long as the structure was solid. Quinton and Grelda spent 3 months that spring and summer working on the Pritchard barn, creating something that would stand for generations. Word of their work spread. They were hired to build a bridge, then a mill, then a series of walls around a wealthy farmer's estate. Each project added to their reputation. People began to seek them out specifically, attracted by the combination of Quinton's experience and Grelda's strength and stamina. The fact that she was an orc became less important than the fact that she did excellent work. Not everyone accepted them, of course. There were still those who muttered about the unnaturalness of human and orc working together, let alone living together. A few times, they faced direct hostility. But Quinton and Grelda faced these challenges together and did not let them deter from their purpose. 2 years after Grelda had built the house, they were hired for their largest project yet, a fortified wall around an entire village on the western frontier. It would take them the better part of a year to complete. The village council had debated extensively before hiring them, but in the end, the need for strong defenses had outweighed their prejudice. Raiders had been attacking settlements in the region, and a stone wall was the best protection available. They moved to temporary housing near the village and began work. The scale of the project was enormous, far larger than anything either of them had undertaken. But they planned carefully, divided the work efficiently, and made steady progress. Quinton handled the technical aspects and the coordination with the village council. Grelda managed the physical labor and trained several local workers who had been assigned to help them. Working together, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost like a dance. Quinton would mark the course and Grelda would set the stones. He would prepare mortar and she would build faces. When one grew tired, the other would take over. They communicated with looks and small gestures, understanding each other so well that words were often unnecessary. The villagers, initially suspicious and hostile, gradually warmed to them. Children would come to watch them work, fascinated by the massive stones and the steady growth of the wall. Older residents would bring them water and food, eventually striking up conversations. Grelda's patience and good humor won over even the most skeptical. Quinton's steady competence and clear dedication to quality work earned respect. By the time the wall was completed, late in the following summer, the village had essentially adopted them as their own. There was a celebration when the last stone was set, with food and music and dancing. The village council formally thanked them and paid their fee with obvious satisfaction. Several other villages sent representatives to discuss similar projects. On the journey home, Quinton and Grelda were tired but satisfied. They had created something important, something that would protect lives, and they had done it together. "I have been thinking," Quinton said as their wagon rolled through the familiar valley toward their house on the rise. "We should make it official." "Make what official?" Grelda asked. "Us, our partnership." He pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. "I want to marry you, Grelda. I want everyone to know that you are my wife and I am your husband. I want to be bound to you in every way possible, legally and socially and spiritually. Will you marry me?" Grelda stared at him, her amber eyes wide. Marriage between humans and orcs is not legal in most territories. The temple would not perform the ceremony. "Then we will find someone who will, or we will do it ourselves, just the two of us, speaking vows before whatever gods care to listen. I do not need a legal document or a priest's blessing to know that I want to spend my life with you. But I want you to have that security, that recognition. I want the world to acknowledge what we already know is true." Tears spilled down Grelda's green cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife and you will be my husband and nothing will ever separate us again." They kissed there in the wagon, Surrounded by the valley they had made their home, as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson. When they finally drove the rest of the way to the house, they were both smiling so hard their faces hurt. Finding someone to marry them proved more challenging than Quinton had anticipated. The temple in the village refused outright, citing laws against interspecies marriage. The traveling priest who occasionally visited the frontier was sympathetic, but bound by church doctrine. Several individuals they approached were willing, but lacked any official standing to perform a legal marriage. In the end, they traveled 3 weeks west to a frontier settlement so remote and lawless that no one particularly cared about the niceties of marriage law. They found a retired priest who had left the church over doctrinal disagreements and was willing to perform whatever ceremonies people requested for a modest fee. He married them in a small cabin with 2 witnesses pulled in from the trading post next door. The ceremony was simple. They wore their work clothes, having nothing fancier. They spoke vows they had written themselves, promising partnership and devotion and lifelong commitment. The retired priest pronounced them married by the authority vested in him by common decency and the frontier tradition of minding one's own business. They signed a document that had no legal weight, but gave them a record of the moment. Then they kissed as husband and wife while the witnesses applauded. On the journey home, Grelda wore a copper ring Quinton had purchased from a metalworker in the settlement. It was not gold or silver, but it was solid and well made, and she refused to take it off even when working with stone. Quinton wore a matching ring that Grelda had insisted on buying for him. They were married now, officially and undeniably, and no law or prejudice could change that. Life continued much as before, but with a new depth of commitment and security. They took on more projects, building their reputation and their business. They hired occasional helpers for the larger jobs, but did most of the work themselves. Money was good, and they began saving toward larger goals, expanding their property, building a proper workshop, perhaps someday training apprentices. 3 years after Grelda had first appeared in Quinton's wall, they were working on a small project near their home when a rider appeared on the road. He was young, probably still in his teens and clearly exhausted. His horse was lathered and blowing. "Are you Olson and Grelda?" he called. "We are," Quinton replied, setting down his tools. "What is the matter? I need your help." "My family lives in Redfield Valley, about 40 miles north of here. There was an earthquake 3 days ago. Our house collapsed. My mother and 2 sisters are trapped inside. We have been trying to dig them out, but the stones keep shifting, and we are afraid to move the wrong thing and bring the rest down on their heads." The young man's voice was desperate. "Someone in the village said you were the best stone workers in the region. Please, will you come?" "We will pay whatever you ask." Quinton looked at Grelda. She was already gathering her tools. "We will come," she said. "Give your horse to Quinton to water and rest while we pack supplies. We can leave within the hour." They made the journey in 2 days, pushing hard. The young man, whose name was Peter, rode ahead to tell his family that help was coming. When Quinton and Grelda arrived at Redfield Valley, they found a scene of devastation. Several buildings had been damaged by the earthquake, and one house had indeed collapsed almost completely. A group of men were standing around it looking helpless. "That is our house," Peter said, pointing. "My father and brothers have been trying to stabilize it, but they are farmers, not builders. They do not know how to work with stone." Quinton studied the collapsed structure carefully. It had been a solid stone house before the earthquake, well built by someone who knew their craft. But the shaking had shifted the foundation and brought down most of the walls. The roof had partially collapsed inward. Getting people out would require carefully removing rubble while ensuring that the rest of the structure did not fall further. "How many people are inside?" he asked. "3. My mother and my 2 younger sisters. We can hear them calling out, but we cannot reach them. It has been 3 days. They must be running out of air. All right, here is what we are going to do." Quinton turned to the assembled men. "We need to stabilize the sections that are still standing. Then we will carefully remove the collapsed material, working from the top down. Grelda will handle the heavy stones. The rest of you will do exactly what we say when we say it. One wrong move could kill everyone inside." "Understood," the men nodded, desperation making them willing to follow the orders of an orc mason without hesitation. Grelda and Quinton worked through the night and into the next day. It was slow, painstaking labor. Each stone had to be examined to determine whether it was bearing weight. Each piece of rubble had to be removed carefully to avoid triggering a further collapse. Grelda's strength was invaluable for moving the heavier stones, but it was Quinton's knowledge and experience that told them which stones to move and in what order. The family inside called out periodically, their voices growing weaker. Quinton spoke to them, explaining what was happening, encouraging them to stay calm and conserve their air. The mother, a woman named Sarah, was remarkable. Despite being trapped in darkness with her daughters for days, she kept her voice steady and helped keep the girls calm. After 16 hours of work, they broke through to the pocket where the family had been trapped. It was a small space created by a fallen beam that had held up part of the collapsed wall, creating a bubble of air. Sarah and her daughters were dirty and exhausted but alive. They were pulled out to cheers from the assembled villagers. The local doctor examined them and declared them bruised and dehydrated but otherwise uninjured. Peter and his father embraced their family members with tears streaming down their faces. Several of the other villagers came to thank Quinton and Grelda personally. "You saved their lives," Peter's father said, gripping Quinton's hand. "I do not know how to thank you." "We did what anyone would do," Quinton replied. "No." Sarah stepped forward, leaning on her husband for support. "Anyone would have tried, but you succeeded because you knew what you were doing. That orc woman has the strength of 3 men and used it with the delicacy of a surgeon, and you directed the whole operation like a general commanding troops." She turned to Grelda. "Thank you, both of you. You have given me back my life and my daughters." Grelda looked uncomfortable with the attention but pleased. "I am glad we could help." The village insisted that Quinton and Grelda stay for several days to rest before making the journey home. They were treated as heroes. Children followed Grelda around asking questions about what it was like to be so strong. Adults who had been initially wary of her overcome their prejudice in the face of what she had done. Peter's family insisted on feeding them every meal and offered payment that Quinton tried to refuse before being overruled. On the journey home, Grelda was quiet for a long time. "Finally," she said, "I spent so long thinking that humans would never accept me, that they would only ever see me as a monster or a threat. But those people treated me like a person. They thanked me and respected me, and they did not care that I am an orc." "They saw what you really are," Quinton said. "Strong and skilled and kind. Once people see that, the rest stops mattering as much. But it took a crisis. It took me saving lives before they were willing to look past my skin and my tusks. Maybe for some people, yes, but not for everyone, not for me." Quinton took her hand. "I saw who you were from the beginning. And every day since then, you have proven that my faith in you was justified. You are the best person I know, Grelda. The fact that it took others longer to see that is their failing, not yours." She squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with emotion. "I am lucky to have found you." "We are lucky to have found each other," Quinton corrected. The years passed in a pattern of work and growth. Olsen and Grelda became one of the most sought-after building teams in the entire frontier region. They worked on houses and barns, bridges and mills, walls and fortifications. Every structure they built bore the same care and quality that had gone into their own home. They trained several apprentices over the years, young people who were willing to learn from an orc master and who went on to spread the techniques and philosophy they had learned. Prejudice did not disappear, but it lessened. More orcs began seeking work in human settlements, using Grelda as an example of what was possible. More humans began questioning the old assumptions about orcs being nothing but violent savages. It was slow change, incremental and frustrating, but it was change nonetheless. 5 years after their marriage, Grelda discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult, as mixed-race pregnancies often were, but she was strong and healthy and determined. Quinton worried constantly, but Grelda remained cheerful and confident. She worked up until the last month, finally agreeing to rest only when Quinton threatened to refuse to work himself unless she stayed home. Their daughter was born in late winter, delivered with the help of a midwife from the village who had overcome her initial reluctance to help an orc. The baby was beautiful, with green-tinged skin lighter than Grelda's and dark hair like Quinton's. Her ears were slightly pointed, and she had tiny tusks that the midwife assured them would grow in properly. They named her Quinn, after Quinton's grandfather, with a traditional orcish middle name in honor of Grelda's heritage. Parenthood was harder than either of them had anticipated, but they faced it with the same partnership that had seen them through everything else. They took turns with night feedings and worked shorter days so they could both spend time with their daughter. Quinn was a happy baby, curious and alert, and she grew quickly. When Quinn was 2 years old, Grelda discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier and resulted in a son they named Quillen. He had his father's skin tone but his mother's amber eyes and pointed ears. The 2 children were adored not only by their parents, but by the wider community that had watched them grow. As the children grew, Quinton and Grelda began taking on fewer long-distance projects and focused on work closer to home. They wanted to be present for Quinn and Quillen, to teach them and play with them and watch them develop. They also wanted to show their children, by example, what it meant to build a life with purpose and meaning. On Quinn's 5th birthday, Quinton took her out to the stone marker that Grelda had placed at the entrance to their house a decade earlier. Quinn could read now, taught by both her parents, and she sounded out the inscription carefully. "What does it mean, Papa?" she asked. "Stone called to stone, heart called to heart." Quinton knelt beside her so they were at eye level. "It means that your mother and I found each other because we were meant to be together. I was working with stone, building walls. She needed to learn stone work to survive. Stone called to stone. But we stayed together because we fell in love. Heart called to heart, and together we built this home and this life in you." Quinn thought about this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "Am I stone or heart?" "You are both," Quinton said, pulling her into a hug. "You are part of what we built together. You are proof that stone and heart can create something beautiful." "I want to build things too," Quinn announced. "Mama is teaching me how to stack rocks properly." "Is she? That is good. Your mother is the best stone worker I have ever known." "And you are the best too, Papa. That is what Mama says. She says together you can build anything." Quinton smiled. "We can, and someday maybe you will build things with us. Would you like that?" "Yes," Quinn hugged him fiercely. "I want to build a house just like you and Mama. A house where people can be happy." That evening, Quinton recounted the conversation to Grelda while they sat together watching the children play in the yard. Quillen was stacking stones into an unstable tower while Quinn corrected his technique with the bossy authority of an older sister. "She has the bug," Grelda said with satisfaction. "Stonework is in her blood now." "Is that what happened to you? Stonework got in your blood?" "No, you got in my blood." Grelda leaned her head on his shoulder. "The stonework was just the door that led me to you." Quinton kissed the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children and the sunset and the valley that had become their home. "You ever regret it?" he asked eventually. "Leaving your clan, being cast out, all the hardship that led you here?" Grelda considered the question. "I regret that it had to be that way. I regret that my clan could not accept my choice. I regret the pain and fear and loneliness. But I do not regret where I ended up. Every hard step led me here, to you and to this life and to our children. So no, I do not regret the journey, only that it had to be so difficult." "I am glad you found me," Quinton said simply. "I did not know I was lonely until you arrived. I did not know I was incomplete until you became part of my life. Everything good that has happened since then traces back to the morning I found you sleeping in my wall. Everything good in my life traces back to you deciding to help me instead of turning me away." Grelda straightened and looked at him seriously. "You saved my life, Quinton. Not just by bandaging my wound, but by giving me hope and purpose and a future. You taught me that I could be more than what my clan thought I should be. You showed me that someone could see past what I was born as and value who I chose to become. You did all the hard work yourself. I just taught you some basic masonry. You taught me much more than that, and you know it." Grelda took his face in her hands. "You taught me that I was worthy of kindness, that I deserved respect, that I could create beautiful things and be proud of them, that I could be loved." Quinton pulled her close, feeling the familiar weight of her in his arms, the warmth of her body against his. After all these years, it still felt like a miracle that she was here, that they had built this life together, that they had created a family and a future from the desperate moment when she had collapsed in his unfinished wall. "I love you," he said. "I will always love you." "I love you too," Grelda replied. "Always." Quinn called out that she had finished building something and wanted them to come see. They stood and walked hand in hand to where the children were playing. Quinn had constructed a small but surprisingly stable wall of stones, carefully fitted together in a miniature version of the techniques they had been teaching her. Quillen had added decorative pebbles along the top. "It is excellent work," Quinton said seriously, examining the wall. "Very sound construction. Will it last forever like your walls?" Quinn asked. "Nothing lasts forever," Grelda said. "But if you build well and build with love, what you create will last long enough to matter. It will stand as proof that you were here and that you cared about doing things properly." Quinn beamed with pride. Quillen clapped his hands and promptly knocked over part of the wall, which made everyone laugh. They spent the rest of the evening playing with the children, building and rebuilding walls of stones and sticks, and whatever else was at hand. When darkness fell, they carried the tired children inside to the house that Grelda had built stone by stone, motivated by love and hope and determination. They put the children to bed in the loft and then sat together by the fire, Grelda's head on Quinton's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "We have built a good life," Quinton said quietly. "We have built a perfect life," Grelda corrected. "Not perfect in the sense that nothing goes wrong or that everything is easy. Perfect in the sense that it is exactly what we both needed. We found each other when we were both lost. We built a home when we were both homeless. We created a family when we were both alone. That is perfect." Quinton could not argue with that. He held his wife close and listened to the fire crackle and thought about all the walls he had built in his life. Some had been commissions, built for money. Some had been practical necessities, built for function. But the walls that mattered most were the ones that had brought Grelda into his life and the ones she had built to keep them together. Stone called to stone, the marker outside proclaimed. Heart called to heart, and here they had made their home. It was the truest thing Quinton had ever known. The walls would stand long after they were gone, proof that an orc girl and a human mason had found each other against impossible odds and built something that would last. Not just the physical structures they created, but the love they shared, and the family they raised, and the example they set for others who came after. The fire burned low and they stayed there together. Two people who had learned that the strongest foundations were built not just from stone, but from trust and commitment and the willingness to believe in each other, even when the whole world said they should not. They had built a life that many said was impossible. They had built walls that would stand for generations. They had built a home where love mattered more than the differences that were supposed to divide them, and in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Not the prejudice they had faced or the obstacles they had overcome, but the simple fact that they had found each other and chosen to build a future together. Stone by stone, day by day, year by year, they had created something beautiful and lasting. They had created home.